ask, how does it feel for someone who does not know Chinese to read this poem? Like, what's their impression?
Well, people can learn to read poetry. So if you come to it with training only in English poetry, it's going to sound very flat. Like a, sort of a descriptive poem. I climbed a mountain, I went down the mountain, I sat by a pool. But if you learn to read Chinese, even translation, you can put the pieces together. People learn how to read. So reading is a skill that you develop over time. It's a way of paying attention, just as reading English poetry is a way of paying attention. It's just a different process of paying attention, noticing different things. And as I was mentioning earlier, you have, of course, the phenomenon that Chinese poetry didn't just belong in China, but was throughout East Asia, and people whose language was radically different language family. Like English grammar is much closer to Chinese grammar than Japanese or Korean grammar.
So is it common to have a title for every poem, or sometimes the titles are added after?
I think we use the word title in maybe the wrong. I mean, I'm sure sometimes titles are added later, but it's just the occasion, the context for reading this poem. And of course, when you write a scroll or do a book, you have to have a title to divide one poem from the other. Otherwise, you're just reading. Since there's no there's no punctuation, no line division like we have in the English translation.
And imagine when he first wrote this poem, he would have written it down in a scroll or
probably on a sheet of paper, more likely, or maybe what they call it a strip of four lenses. But he might have composed it then. He might have composed it later, but he might have composed it in his mind and then written it down.
His poem seems really pictorial, like lots of images.
It's a lot of images, but each of those images is a percept. That's a proper term, right? It's something, the object of the senses. So that if you stop reading them just as images and read them as a way of seeing, noticing, and a movement of attention and body, actually, then that changes the poem. It ceases to be just a purely visual thing. It's like one of those horizontal landscape scrolls, which basically walk you through a space. And you go on the scroll, you roll up one side and unroll the other. But what seems to be static, when you read it in English, you learn to read it. It's not static. As we did in the early poem we talked about earlier, if you saw that.
How do we learn to read?
You learn to read, I think, by sitting around like this and going over poems with somebody that's been reading Chinese poetry a lot, that's read a lot about Chinese poetics, and then you do it. The more you do it, you gradually learn to do it. The same way you learn to read English poetry. Even you may be a native English speaker, no one is born with the ability to read English poetry. It takes time.
Would you mind reading it in Chinese for us, and I guess us experiencing it from...
Yeah, I wish I could. I used to bring the Middle Chinese and try to do the reconstruction, because what you don't, for example, ru, to enter in the second line, is nip. So I should ideally read it in Cantonese, right? 不知香几色，树里入远方，古树无人径，山山何处踪？犬声夜为食，日色冷青松。我目空长曲，安禅志杜龙。But that's reading it in Mandarin. And of course, Middle Chinese sounded very, very different from Mandarin. So you often find people expressing how moved they are by the sounds of the poem, and they're Mandarin speakers. And you realize that you can be moved by the sounds, but it's partially the association that sounds develop from a history of reading, right? I had some Korean students who were trained in traditional, and if Korean pronunciation of Chinese characters is nothing like Chinese or even, and they would read it with great emotion, right? Because they were very familiar with the Chinese poetry, and they learned Chinese traditional the Korean reading techniques. And so what they did was, it was just very moving to them. They were ready to burst into tears,